Early in the Pacific War, American naval aviators believed they were facing masters. Japanese carrier pilots had proven their skill at Pearl Harbor and in the first carrier battles, and many U.S. pilots entered combat knowing the enemy had more experience. But by the summer of 1944, something had quietly changed. Years later, in carrier action reports and radar logs, the moment becomes clear. The records are still there, and I've listed them below. The sky over the Philippine Sea would show that the balance in the air had completely reversed. Here is that story.
June 19th, 1944. The Western Pacific. The air is already heavy before dawn. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, radar operators stare at their scopes. Then, one by one, the contacts appear. Dozens, then hundreds. Incoming from the west, from Japanese carriers still hundreds of miles away. Wave after wave of aircraft, rising off flight decks and forming up in the warm sky over the Philippine Sea. The largest carrier strike Japan has ever assembled since the opening day of the war. 2 years earlier, those Japanese pilots had been the finest carrier aviators on Earth. They had humiliated the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor. They had pressed attacks at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz with a discipline and ferocity that left American survivors shaken. The gap had been real. The fear had been earned. But now, inside the darkened combat information centers of American carriers, something different is happening. Fighter direction officers track the incoming formations with calm precision. Vectors are assigned. Altitudes are given. F6F Hellcats begin climbing toward their intercept points, guided not by instinct alone, but by a system built over 2 brutal years of learning. The fighters reach altitude before the enemy arrives. They choose where the fight begins. Within minutes, Japanese aircraft begin falling from the sky in clusters. Bombers disintegrate. Fighters spiral into the sea. Formations that were tight over the horizon break apart under coordinated assault. The fleet barely flinches. How did the side that once felt outclassed turn Japan's last great airstrike into a massacre? To understand what happened over the Philippine Sea, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning, for the men who flew American naval aircraft, was not glorious. It was painful. During the first 6 months of the war, Japanese naval air power achieved spectacular success, spearheading offensive operations against Allied forces across the Pacific. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force attacked Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet and destroying over 188 American aircraft at the cost of just 29 planes lost. The precision of that strike was not accidental. Those pilots had been selected through a training pipeline so demanding that more than 1,500 applied for a slot in a single training class. Only 70 were selected, and 25 graduated. Years of schooling, years of carrier operations. Many had combat experience from China, from a war that had been grinding since the late 1930s. What arrived over Oahu that Sunday morning was not raw aggression. It was a finely honed weapon, and in the months that followed, the weapon kept cutting. On December 10th, Japanese naval land-based bombers sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, the first time capital ships were sunk by aerial attack while underway. The lesson was unmistakable. Air power delivered by well-trained crews could reach farther, hit harder, and change outcomes faster than any battleship. For the American naval aviators watching all of this unfold, the feeling was not abstract. It was personal. The pilots they were going up against were not reckless. They were precise. Their torpedo runs came in low and steady. Their dive bombers held formation through anti-aircraft fire with a discipline that unnerved defenders. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the two navies clashed in the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. Previous attempts to win, a climactic battle with the U.S. Navy at Coral Sea, Midway, and the sum of the sea battles in the Solomons had either failed or come short of a war-changing victory. But Coral Sea was expensive. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington, and the damage to Yorktown, which the Navy scrambled to repair in time for Midway, spoke to the lethality of those Japanese air groups. Then came the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. The Battle of Midway, the Solomon Islands Campaign, and the New Guinea Campaign, notably the naval battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands, decimated the veteran air crews of the Japanese Naval Air Service. But at Santa Cruz, the cost was savage on the American side too. The carrier Hornet was lost. Dive bombers and torpedo planes pressed home attacks with relentless efficiency. American fighter pilots who survived those engagements came away knowing the truth. They were fighting professionals, and too many of their own squadrons were still green. The gap was not imagined. It was felt in every ready room, every debrief, every memorial for a pilot who didn't come back. Japanese carrier aviators had spent years perfecting carrier operations. Prior to the war, Japanese carrier pilots were carefully selected after undergoing years of training in specialized schools, which produced high-quality aircrew but at low volume. American replacements were being produced faster, but speed did not always mean readiness. The professionals on the other side of the Pacific had a head start that could not be wished away. And in those first terrible months, no one knew when or if the gap would close. It was an honest fear. A fear born not of cowardice but of evidence. The men who had trained for years in Japan's elite naval aviation schools had proven what they could do. And the Americans were still learning. What no one could yet see was that the learning itself would become the weapon. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe so these stories aren't lost. The American Navy's position in the Pacific after the first year of war was not one of comfort. It was one of survival. Midway, in June 1942, is remembered as a decisive victory. And it was. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. The offensive momentum of the Imperial Japanese Navy broken. But the cost of that victory, and the chaos inside it, told a different story about where American naval aviation actually stood. At Midway, American torpedo squadrons were nearly annihilated. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet attacked without fighter escort. Every aircraft was shot down. Only one man survived. The other torpedo squadrons fared almost as badly. Their sacrifice drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude, which opened the door for the dive bombers above. But the system that was supposed to coordinate these strikes had essentially failed. The timing was accidental. The miracle of Midway was that it worked at all. The fighter direction at Midway was overwhelmed. Unlike the overburdened radio channels and lost messages experienced at Midway, the U.S. fleet would later develop sufficient frequencies and communications training, discipline, experience, and doctrine to maintain good command coordination and control. But that was later. At Midway itself, the radios jammed. The coordination broke down. Fighters assigned to protect the fleet were sent to the wrong altitudes. Incoming Japanese strikes hit ships that should have had better warning. It was a victory, but it was a ragged one. And then came Guadalcanal. The 6-month campaign in the Solomons became a meat grinder for both sides. American and Japanese air groups fought daily over Henderson Field and the waters around the island. Aircrew losses suffered during earlier carrier battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the long Solomon Islands campaign of 1942 and 43 had greatly weakened the Japanese Navy's ability to project force with its carriers. Losses suffered in the Solomons drastically reduced the number of skilled carrier pilots available to fill the carrier air groups. But it bled the Americans too. Pilots were lost. Planes were lost. The learning curve was brutal and unforgiving. In those early Solomons battles, American fighter direction was still evolving. The Solomons campaign brought on 2 more Japanese versus American carrier sea battles with even more disappointing fighter direction and a resulting demand for better shipboard facilities and improvements in radar. The problem was becoming clear. Individual bravery was not enough. Individual skill was not enough. The Japanese had built their air arm around exceptional individuals, pilots trained to near perfection over years. And for a while, that approach dominated. But the Americans were beginning to realize something. A duel favored the duelist with more experience. If this war remained a series of individual encounters, the side with the longer training pipeline and the deeper well of combat hours would keep winning. America could not outduel Japan in 1942. It did not have the bench. What it could do was change the nature of the fight itself, not through one innovation, not through one new airplane, but through a fundamental shift in how air combat was organized, supported, and directed. The scattered individual was going to become part of a coordinated system. The pilot was going to become a component of something larger than himself. That transformation had already begun. In the wreckage of those early battles, in the cramped plotting rooms of damaged carriers, in the classrooms of hastily expanded training schools, the U.S. Navy was quietly rewriting the rules of naval air warfare. It just wasn't finished yet. The rebuilding did not begin with a dramatic order from a single commander. It began in 100 places at once: training fields in Florida and Texas, radar schools in Georgia, aircraft factories on Long Island, gunnery ranges in the desert. Each piece was part of a system that no one person designed whole, but that the institutional machinery of the United States Navy assembled with increasing deliberation. The first change was volume. In 1942, U.S. Navy pilot training programs started to ramp up. 10,869 aviators received their wings, almost twice as many as had completed the program in the previous 8 years. In 1943, there were more than 20,000 graduates. In 1944, over 21,000. But volume alone meant nothing if the pilots could not fight, and the Navy knew it. So even as the pipeline expanded, standards were not lowered, they were refined. With sizable numbers of reserve pilots and a large training program, and with the new Essex carriers not due to start joining the fleet until late 1943, the American Navy actually increased its training requirements. The pilots who manned the new carriers all had a minimum of 2 years training and 500 hours flight time. This was an extraordinary decision. In the middle of a war where every month mattered, where losses at sea demanded immediate replacements, the Navy chose to slow down the final stage of preparation rather than rush pilots to the fleet. The reasoning was cold and clear. A pilot with 300 hours who died on his first engagement cost more than the months it took to give him 500 hours and bring him home. Gunnery training was overhauled. Deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target and placing rounds where the enemy will be, not where he is, became a central focus. Pilots practiced on towed sleeve targets until the skill became reflexive. They trained in sections of 2, then divisions of 4, learning to fight as pairs rather than lone hunters. The tactical revolution was equally important. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch realized that if they ever met the zero in combat, they would have to make up the performance difference with superior tactics. He spent many nights using matchsticks on his dining room table to represent airplanes. He realized that the present Navy practice of using 3-plane sections hampered maneuverability. In a 2-plane section, the aircraft should be at a greater separation, equal to the diameter of the tightest turn. If one plane was attacked, the 2 planes could turn toward each other, and the guns of the wingmen would be pointed at the attacker. The thatch weave, as it came to be known, was not a theoretical exercise. It was born of desperation, tested in combat, and disseminated through the fleet as doctrine. But the deepest change happened in the dark rooms below the flight decks, the Combat Information Center. Admiral Nimitz decreed that every Pacific Fleet combatant ship would have a new, properly equipped radar plotting room to be called the Combat Operations Center, later changed to Combat Information Center. These spaces became the nerve centers of fleet air defense. Radar operators tracked contacts, plotters mapped the air picture on transparent boards, and fighter direction officers, the men who would determine where and when American fighters met the enemy, refined their craft into something approaching a science. In early 1943, new fleet carriers of the Essex class and light carriers of the Independence class began arriving in the Pacific. They were equipped with new, highly capable radars, including height finders and spacious, well-equipped combat information centers. The fighter direction schools expanded. By March 1943, the Norfolk Fighter Director School was becoming overcrowded. The Vice Chief of Naval Operations and the Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics recommended a new school be established large enough to meet all the fighter director needs of both the Navy and the Marine Corps. This was estimated at 25 Marine officers and 100 naval officers per month. In May 1943, the Chief of Naval Operations directed that the school be relocated to Naval Air Station St. Simons Island, Georgia. What emerged was not a collection of talented individuals. It was an integrated system. A radar operator could see an incoming threat. A plotter could track its course. An FDO could assign fighters to intercept at the right altitude, the right bearing, and the right time. And the pilot, arriving at his assigned position, could see the enemy below him, with altitude advantage and the initiative already in hand. The Japanese had built the finest individual aviators in the world. The Americans were building something else. They were building a machine, and the machine was almost ready. There was still one missing piece: the airplane. In 1942, the standard American carrier fighter was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It was tough. It was honest. But against the Mitsubishi A6M0, it was overmatched in almost every performance category that mattered in a dogfight. The Zero climbed faster. It turned tighter. It had longer range. Intelligence reports described the Zero as capable of climbing at more than 5,000 feet per minute with a top speed of 332 miles per hour. Corresponding figures for the Wildcat were 2,300 feet per minute and 330 miles per hour. Further, the Zero could make a much tighter turn. The Wildcat survived because its pilots learned to avoid turning fights, to use diving attacks, and to absorb punishment that would have destroyed its opponent. But surviving was not the same as dominating. Grumman had been working on a replacement since before the war reached its worst. Throughout early 1942, Leroy Grumman, along with his chief designers Jake Swirbel and Bill Schwendler, worked closely with the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics and experienced F4F pilots to develop the new fighter in such a way that it could counter the Zero's strengths. The information flowed both ways. Combat veterans walked through the Grumman factory and described what they needed. Not a plane that could outturn the Zero, That was the wrong goal. They needed a plane that could outclimb it, outdive it, absorb hits, and bring them home. The F6F Hellcat made its combat debut in September 1943, and the effect was immediate. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was an American carrier-based fighter aircraft of World War II. Designed to replace the earlier F4F Wildcat and to counter the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, it was the United States Navy's dominant fighter in the second half of the Pacific War. The Hellcat was not the fastest fighter in the sky. It was not the most elegant. It was not designed to win a turning contest with a zero at low speed. It was designed to win the war. Its design featured a powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. That massive engine gave it speed in the dive and rate of climb that the Zero could not match. A bullet-resistant windshield and a total of 212 pounds of cockpit armor was fitted, along with armor around the oil tank and oil cooler. A 250-gallon self-sealing fuel tank was fitted in the fuselage. Where the Zero sacrificed everything for agility, building the lightest possible airframe without armor or self-sealing tanks, the Hellcat embraced weight. It embraced protection. Most Japanese aircraft, including the Zero, gained their great maneuverability at the expense of armor and resilience. Hellcat pilots reported that most Japanese aircraft they shot down either exploded or caught fire, while the Hellcat could take a great deal of damage and still stay in the air. This mattered enormously for the system the Navy had built. A training pipeline that produced 500-hour pilots was wasted if those pilots died on their first mission because their airplane could not take a hit. The Hellcat was forgiving. It was stable in carrier approaches. It did not punish the small mistakes that newer pilots inevitably made. It multiplied competence. The F6F accounted for 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed, an astonishing figure that comprised 75% of the U.S. Navy's total air-to-air victories during the war. With a kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1, the Hellcat demonstrated its unmatched effectiveness in aerial engagements. This remarkable ratio meant that for nearly every American Hellcat lost, 19 enemy aircraft were shot down. At peak production, Grumman rolled one Hellcat off the assembly line every hour around the clock. By the time the fleet needed them in volume, they were there, not in dozens, but in hundreds. Not filling one carrier, but filling 15. The Hellcat did not require aces. It created the conditions under which average pilots, well-trained and well-directed, could defeat opponents who had once been considered elite. It did not rely on perfection. It multiplied competence into a force that no amount of individual brilliance on the other side could overcome. And on the other side, brilliance was running out. By the spring of 1944, the war had reached the inner ring of Japan's defensive perimeter. The U.S. Navy's offensive in the Central Pacific gathered tremendous strength in early 1944 and moved to within striking distance of Japan. With the threat of an American push into the Marianas Islands by June, the Imperial Japanese Navy hoped to protect their home islands. The island of Saipan, only 1,200 nautical miles south of Tokyo, would give American forces a prime location from which to stage airstrikes. If Saipan fell, and the neighboring islands of Tinian and Guam fell with it, the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. The strategic implications were existential. Saipan was not another island to be traded. It was a gate, and Japan intended to slam it shut. Realizing the powerful American fast carrier task forces had to be stopped no matter the cost, Japanese commanders again pinned their hopes on a plan for a decisive battle. The operation was designated a Go. In September 1943, Japanese Imperial Headquarters resolved that the entire strength of their fleet would be deployed against the U.S. Navy in a great decisive battle, and that the enemy fleet would be destroyed in one blow. By the spring of 1944, Japanese commanders had decided the decisive encounter was imminent. On June 15, 1944, American forces landed on Saipan. A preliminary U.S. carrier strike on June 11 persuaded Admiral Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, that this was where the next landings would take place, and Japanese forces began to converge on the Marianas for the decisive battle. The Japanese fleet that sortied was formidable on paper. Vice Admiral Ozawa's fleet consisted of 6 heavy carriers: the Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, Ryuho, and Hiyo, 3 light carriers, and battleships including the Yamato and Musashi. The plan was straightforward in concept and ambitious in execution. Japanese carriers had a range advantage. Their aircraft, lighter and carrying less armor, could fly farther. Ozawa intended to launch his strikes from beyond the effective range of American carrier aircraft, hitting the U.S. fleet while staying out of its reach. The AGO plan was based on the assumption that land-based air bases within range would complement the carriers. The Japanese command knew their forces would suffer from considerable inferiority in carrier air power, and were depending on land-based air power to redress the balance. But the plan had weaknesses that its architects either could not see or could not admit. The land-based aircraft that were supposed to supplement the carriers had already been severely degraded by American strikes on Marianas airfields in the days before the battle. The Japanese had been hoping the American attack would come farther south. Their land-based aircraft had been disposed accordingly, with relatively weak forces in the Marianas. And there was something worse, something the Japanese High Command had tried to address but could not fix in time. Japanese naval airmen were inadequately trained. The Japanese training programs could not replace the quality aviators lost during the past 2 years of the Pacific Campaign. Flying against the well-trained and often veteran U.S. aviators, it was a one-sided contest. Some Japanese pilots went into action with as little as 3 months of training, whereas many U.S. pilots had spent 2 full years in training. By 1944, Japan's supply of skilled pilots was so limited that many flight instructors were reassigned from training units to Ozawa's mobile fleet. The very men who were supposed to be training the next generation were pulled to the front. It was a decision born of desperation, and it guaranteed that the decline would accelerate. The threat from American submarines restricted Japanese carriers to their anchorage so that they were unable to conduct proper flight training in the run-up to the battle. The fleet that sailed toward the Philippine Sea carried aircrews who, in many cases, had never practiced a coordinated strike against a defended carrier force. They had never faced radar-directed interception. They had never encountered the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of a fast carrier task group in full defensive posture. They were about to. The American fleet was waiting. Task Force 58 was commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Under him were 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, organized into 4 task groups spread across miles of ocean. The fleet carried more than 900 aircraft. The newest Essex-class carriers were equipped with the latest radar suites and spacious combat information centers. The new Essex and Independence-class carriers met their first test against an enemy fleet in the Philippine Sea. All 15 carriers in the action, except the Enterprise, had joined the fleet less than a year before. Above the fleet, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet. Spruance had concerns that the Japanese would attempt to draw his main fleet away from the Marianas with a diversionary force, while slipping an attack force in to destroy the landing fleet. Locating and destroying the Japanese fleet was not his primary objective, and he was unwilling to allow the main strike force of the Pacific Fleet to be drawn westward. Spruance chose defense. He kept the fleet near Saipan, protecting the amphibious forces. The carriers would absorb whatever Japan threw at them and fight a defensive battle. That decision would later draw criticism. Some felt Spruance should have sailed west aggressively to strike the Japanese carriers before they could launch. But the decision had a consequence that no one fully anticipated. It meant the entire defensive apparatus the Navy had spent 2 years building would be tested at maximum capacity. Every radar, every combat information center, every fighter direction officer, every Hellcat pilot. All of it together at once. American submarines discovered the approaching Japanese force of 9 carriers and alerted Admiral Spruance. The submarines had been tracking Ozawa's fleet for days, providing the kind of intelligence that reduced uncertainty and sharpened preparation. On the morning of June 19th, the fleet went to general quarters before dawn. The radar operators watched their screens. The Americans headed east, into the morning wind as the sun rose at 4:30. At 5:15, the Americans picked up their first bogies, and the carriers scrambled their F6F combat air patrols. By 7 in the morning, the American Combat Air Patrol had splashed 10 Japanese scouts from Ozawa's first phase search. The scouts were supposed to locate the American fleet and relay its position back to the carriers. Some succeeded. Many did not return. Then the main strikes began forming up to the west. Inside the CICs, the picture was building. Radar could detect large formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. By 1944, American ships began to be equipped with combat information centers, equipped to process radar data and vector fighters accordingly. The IFF systems could distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy. Height-finding radars could estimate the altitude of incoming formations. And the fighter direction officers, trained at the schools that had expanded just for this purpose, began issuing vectors. Hellcats were launched in waves. Divisions of 4 climbed to altitude, stacking at different levels to create a layered defense. They were directed to intercept points well ahead of the fleet, creating an aerial barrier that the incoming strikes would have to pass through before reaching the ships. The system was in place. The pilots were ready. The radar was watching. And the Japanese were coming. This was the moment everything had been built for. The first Japanese strike wave consisted of approximately 69 aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo planes. They had launched from Ozawa's carriers and formed up in the warm air west of the fleet. The formation was tight as they began their approach. Many of the pilots had never made a strike against a defended fleet before. Some had never seen an American carrier group. They were detected long before they arrived. Fighter direction officers aboard the carriers assigned Hellcat divisions to intercept. The fighters climbed to altitude and turned toward the incoming formation, guided by continuous radar updates relayed through their headsets. By the time the Japanese pilots saw the Hellcats, the Americans had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and the initiative. The interception began roughly 50 to 60 miles from the fleet. This was the critical innovation. In the earlier carrier battles at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, interceptions had often happened close to the ships, or not at all. Fighters were scrambled late, sent to the wrong altitude, or overwhelmed by the volume of communications. The system had been too fragile. Now it worked. Mitcher's aviators and anti-aircraft gunners needed only 34 minutes to decimate Ozawa's first raid. Of the 69 enemy aircraft, all but 27 had been splashed. The speed of the destruction was almost disorienting. Hellcat pilots dove through the Japanese formations with coordinated slashing attacks. Pairs of fighters worked together, one engaging while the other covered. The heavier, faster Hellcats used dive and zoom tactics, striking from above, pulling through, and climbing back to altitude before the lighter Zeros could turn to engage. Against the bombers, the result was devastating. The Judys and Jills, laden with ordnance and committed to their attack runs, had almost no capacity to defend themselves against the kind of organized interception they were facing. Formations that had been disciplined broke apart. Pilots who had trained for months but never experienced this level of coordinated resistance began to maneuver defensively, jettisoning bombs and torpedoes before reaching the fleet. Others pressed on, alone or in fragments, only to encounter the next layer of defense, the anti-aircraft fire of the task force itself. Only a handful of Japanese aircraft survived the air screen and made runs at American ships, most unsuccessfully. A bomb crashed onto the battleship South Dakota, killing 27 men and wounding another 23, but not one Japanese plane reached its ultimate goal, the American carriers. The first wave was over. 42 of 69 aircraft destroyed. The remainder scattered, some limping back toward their carriers, others diverting toward Guam. The Americans had lost fewer than a handful of Hellcats. The imbalance was not subtle. It was total. And the day was just beginning. The second Japanese strike was larger. Approximately 128 aircraft, a mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, launched from Ozawa's carriers and headed east. American radar picked up the oncoming group at 11:07, only 10 minutes after the first raid had departed. Pilots barely had time to land, refuel, and rearm before again rising to meet the enemy. The same pattern repeated. Fighter direction officers assigned intercept vectors. Hellcats climbed. The interceptions began well ahead of the fleet. The second larger raid of 128 lost over 100 aircraft. The losses were staggering. Japanese formations fragmented under the weight of coordinated attack. Dive bombers that had been assigned specific targets never reached the outer screen of destroyers. Torpedo planes that were supposed to approach low and fast were caught by Hellcats that had been stacked at multiple altitudes precisely to prevent such runs. F6F Hellcat fighter pilot Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vratziu, flying off Lexington, dove into an enemy formation and shot down 6 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers in 8 minutes, using only 360 rounds of ammunition. After landing back on his carrier, he held up 6 fingers to the admiral watching from above. A shipmate soon gave the highly one-sided battle its nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But beneath the nickname was something the pilots understood instinctively, even if they could not articulate it in the moment. This was not happening because American pilots had suddenly become supermen. It was happening because every element of the defense was working in concert. The radar saw the threat early. The CIC processed the information. The FDO made the call. The pilots received clear, timely vectors. The fighters arrived with altitude and energy, and the aircraft they flew could take punishment and deliver firepower that the lightly built Japanese planes could not survive. A third strike was launched. It fared no better. A fourth Japanese raid was launched between 1100 and 1130, but pilots had been given an incorrect position for the U.S. fleet and could not locate it. They broke into two loose groups and turned for Guam and Rota to refuel. The larger group of Japanese aircraft had flown to Guam and were intercepted over Orote Field by 27 Hellcats while landing. 30 of the 49 Japanese aircraft were shot down, and the rest were damaged beyond repair. By nightfall on June 19th, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. Japanese losses exceeded 350 planes on the first day of battle. The fleet was intact. The carriers were untouched. The system had held. And somewhere beneath the waves west of the Marianas, 2 Japanese carriers were already gone. The submarine Albacore had torpedoed Ozawa's flagship, the brand-new carrier Taiho. Hours later, the submarine Kavala found the veteran carrier Shokaku, one of the ships that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike, and put torpedoes into her. Both carriers sank. The day that was supposed to be Japan's decisive victory had become its most devastating defeat since Midway. And there was still one more day to come. The numbers, when they were finally assembled, told a story that was difficult to absorb even for the men who had lived through it. Over 2 days, the Japanese lost nearly 600 aircraft, 200 land-based and 400 carrier-based, not to mention most of their crews. Japan had also lost 3 carriers. Against this, the United States suffered the loss of 123 aircraft and 109 personnel, mostly during the night return. The asymmetry was breathtaking. The Americans lost fewer than 24 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. But the numbers of aircraft destroyed, as devastating as they were not the deepest wound. Japan could build more airplanes. Its factories, though increasingly strained, were still producing. Japan slowly increased the number of aircraft it produced from about 5,000 in 1941 to just more than 28,000 in 1944. The wound that could not heal was the loss of the men who flew them. Losses by the Japanese would prove irreplaceable. Japanese naval air power ceased to exist. The loss of experienced pilots would prove costliest of all. This was the grim mathematics of attrition warfare applied to a resource that could not be manufactured. A carrier could be built in a shipyard. An airplane could be assembled in a factory. But a trained carrier pilot, one who could navigate over open ocean, find his target, press an attack under fire, and recover aboard a moving flight deck, required years of preparation and hundreds of hours of flight time. Japan's training pipeline had been designed for quality, not quantity. As combat casualties mounted starting in 1942, the long duration of the pilot training program, combined with a shortage of gasoline for training, prevented the Japanese from rapidly providing qualified replacement pilots. Moreover, Japan, unlike the US or Britain, never altered its program to speed up the training process of its recruits. The resultant decrease in pilot quantity and quality contributed to increasing losses. In mid-1944, Japanese carrier aircrews possessed just 2 to 6 months of training. This declined through the end of the war, when Japanese aviators averaged only 100 hours of flight experience. While American aviators had up to 400 hours of flying time, some Japanese pilots had as little as 20 in their logbooks. The contrast was now inverted from what it had been in 1941. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots had been the veterans and Americans the novices. At the Philippine Sea, the Americans were the seasoned professionals, and the Japanese were the ones being sent into battle barely prepared. The professional gap had not just closed, it had flipped. Completely. And the destruction over those 2 June days ensured it would never flip back. What remained of Japan's carrier aviation after the Philippine Sea was not a force. It was a memory. Japan still had carriers after the Philippine Sea. The Zuikaku survived, damaged but afloat. Other flat-tops remained in the fleet. On paper, the Imperial Japanese Navy still possessed a carrier force. But a carrier without trained aviators is not a warship. It is an empty platform, a floating target. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was a major naval battle that eliminated the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale carrier actions. The destruction of June 19th and 20th was not merely tactical, it was structural. The organism that had once projected Japanese air power across thousands of miles of ocean had been gutted of its most essential component, the human beings who made it function. It took nearly a year for the Japanese to reconstitute their carrier air groups following the Solomons campaign. After the Philippine Sea, there would be no reconstitution. The training schools had already been stripped of instructors. The fuel for training flights was increasingly scarce. The pipeline that had once produced the finest carrier aviators in the world had been broken, and there was no time, no fuel, and no institutional capacity to rebuild it. Japan no longer had enough oil tankers to transport the required volume of petroleum from the Dutch East Indies to Japanese refineries. Without adequate supplies of refined fuel oil, Japanese aircraft carriers refueled with unrefined Tarakan petroleum in June 1944. This undesalted petroleum damaged boiler tubes, and the unremoved naphtha fraction volatilized the fuel to form explosive atmospheres. Even the fuel the carriers burned was poisoning them from within. The consequences unfolded with terrible logic. By late 1944, Japanese naval air strength had been effectively crippled, with the First Air Fleet acting only as a decoy during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October. At Cap Engano, Japanese carriers sailed as bait, deliberately drawing the American fast carrier force away from the landing beaches at Leyte. They carried almost no aircraft. Their flight decks, once the most feared platforms in the Pacific, were empty. The carriers that had defined an era of naval warfare were being used as sacrificial pawns. Following the naval battle at Leyte, remnants of Japanese naval aviation were limited to land-based operations, increasingly characterized by kamikaze attacks. The transition from conventional naval aviation to suicide tactics was not a choice made from strength. It was an acknowledgement that conventional tactics required a level of pilot skill that Japan could no longer produce. In 1944, Japan had aircraft, but not the competent pilots to fly them effectively, and resorted to the kamikaze. The sky over the Philippine Sea had not just decided a battle. It had decided the rest of the war at sea. Every carrier engagement that followed, every kamikaze wave, every desperate sortie from island airfields, flowed from the catastrophe of those 2 days in June. The Japanese Naval Air Arm did not decline gradually after the Philippine Sea. It collapsed, and the collapse was irreversible. After Saipan, the effects were felt immediately in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's cabinet fell, and within months, Marianas-based B-29 superfortresses began burning out the heart of Japan's urban industrial areas. The battle that Japan hoped would save its inner defensive ring instead broke it open, and through the breach poured the bombers that would carry the war to the home islands themselves. Go back to 1942. Picture a young American naval aviator standing on the flight deck of a carrier somewhere in the South Pacific. He has completed his training. He has his wings. He has perhaps 300 hours of flight time, most of it in trainers and transition aircraft. He has never been in combat. Across the ocean, his opponent has been flying for years. The Japanese pilot assigned to the carrier striking force has logged more combat hours than some entire American squadrons combined. He has dropped bombs on Chinese cities. He has practiced torpedo runs until they are reflexive. He has operated from carrier decks in conditions that would challenge the most experienced aviator in any navy on Earth. The American knows this. He has heard the intelligence briefings. He has seen what happened at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea. He has watched friends not come back. The gap between his experience and his opponents is not an abstraction. It is a weight he carries every time. He climbs into his cockpit. Now move forward. 2 years. June 1944. That same American aviator, or one trained by the system that replaced him, sits in the cockpit of an F6F Hellcat. He has 500 hours of flight time. He has practiced deflection gunnery until his accuracy is instinctive. He flies in a section of 2, a division of 4, each pilot covering the other. His radio works. His radar-equipped carrier sees the enemy before the enemy sees him. A fighter direction officer gives him an altitude, a heading, and a time. He arrives at the intercept point with energy, altitude, and the initiative. Below him, the incoming Japanese formation is made up of pilots with, in some cases, fewer than 100 hours of flight time. Their planes are light and fast, but fragile. Their radios are unreliable. Their formations begin to break apart the moment the first Hellcats roll in from above. Within minutes, the sky is full of falling aircraft. Burning wings, shattered canopies, debris spiraling into the Pacific. A battle had been won which, with the possible exception of Midway, would have more influence on the final outcome than any other battle of the whole war. And it had been accomplished without the loss of a single ship. The inversion is complete, total, irreversible. And the lesson of the Philippine Sea is not that America produced better individual pilots than Japan. In 1941, that was clearly not the case. The lesson is that individual excellence, no matter how extraordinary, cannot survive against an integrated system that combines technology, training, doctrine, and industrial capacity into a single coordinated instrument of war. Japan had built its naval air arm around the individual, the brilliance of the lone pilot, honed over years of demanding selection and training. When those individuals were lost, at Midway, in the Solomons, in the grinding attrition of 1943, they could not be replaced. The system that produced them was too narrow, too slow, too rigid to adapt. America built something different. It built a system that could absorb losses, replace pilots, upgrade aircraft, refine tactics, and improve coordination, all simultaneously, all continuously, all at industrial scale. Its success was based on a specific context, an industry capable of mass production, increasingly well-trained pilots, and a coherent naval aviation doctrine. The Hellcat did not win by being the best fighter in the world. It won by being the right fighter for the system. The FDO did not win by being a genius. He won by being part of a process that turned radar data into precise fighter vectors. The pilot did not win by being an ace. He won by arriving at the right place, at the right time, with the right altitude, in the right airplane, supported by the right information. No single element was decisive. Together, they were unstoppable. The two-day engagement had been the largest pure carrier versus carrier battle in history, and was to be the last. The immediate consequence of the Japanese defeat was the capture of the Marianas. This broke the Japanese inner line of defense and meant that American bombers based in the islands could now reach targets on Japan itself. Never again would the Japanese Navy be able to attack the Americans with any hope of success. The losses inflicted by the Hellcat soon forced the Japanese into an act of desperation, the kamikaze. The amateurs of 1942 did not just catch up. They changed the nature of the contest. They replaced the duel with the system. They replaced the swordsman with the machine. And the sky over the Philippine Sea, on those 2 long June days, marked the moment the transformation became irreversible. The moment when the greatest carrier air arm the world had ever seen flew into a wall it could not penetrate. Built not by heroes, but by a nation that had learned, adapted, and organized its way to dominance. The pilots who landed on their carriers that evening, exhausted and stunned by the scale of what they had done, could not know everything that would follow. The fall of Tojo's government, the B-29 raids that would burn Japan's cities, the kamikazes that would come as a consequence of the void they had just created, the surrender in Tokyo Bay, aboard a battleship ringed by the same fleet that had fought over the Philippine Sea. They could not know all of that. But they knew one thing. The sky had changed, and it was never going back.